You know, it's interesting when we look at the New Testament and we see Jesus' life, that Jesus had a plan and he had a purpose. But what's interesting about that plan and that purpose was it wasn't always politically correct. I mean, Jesus never rubbed people the wrong way, did he? No. It wasn't always in line with the church doctrine, if you know what I'm saying. God forbid, right? But Jesus' purpose and plan was always in line with God. It was always in line with God's word, and it was always in line with God's will. Now, I want to give you a little background this morning. The political climate in Jesus' day, Israel was a divided nation. The Jews of the north and the Jews of the south, let's just say they hated one another. They didn't get along. They called each other heretics and blasphemers. Jews opposed Jews in a racial conflict based on where they lived. Go figure. The border between the two was seldom crossed. And if a Jew from the south had to go to the north to do business, well, let's just say that in areas north of Samaria, they would travel many miles and go around out of the way to risk any contact with those Samaritan dogs. Yeah, Samaritan dogs. Why were they called Samaritan dogs? Because, well, they were a product of unlawful marriages between Jews and idol worshipers. And they had corrupted the Jewish religion. Jews considered anyone who lived in Samaria a half-breed. And Samaritans weren't allowed to worship in the temple because of their idolatry. And so the Samaritans built their own temple. In time, Samaria became a haven for all kinds of outlaws. The outlaws came from the south, from Judea. And the Samaritans welcomed these outlaws with open arms, these criminals and refugees who had violated the Jewish religion and been excommunicated according to the law of Moses. That really fueled the flames of division and hatred. And no faithful Jew would be caught dead speaking with a Samaritan. Jews felt that Samaritans were animals, nothing more than dogs in their opinion. Jesus, on the other hand, didn't get involved in this racial conflict. He didn't choose sides. He went where he wanted to go and did what he wanted to do. Because Jesus is an equal opportunity Savior. It doesn't matter to Jesus whether you're white or black. It doesn't matter to Jesus whether or not you're Jew or Greek. It doesn't matter. He doesn't consider your bank account. He doesn't consider your station in life or your occupation or your standing in the community. No, all he looks at is the condition of your heart and whether or not you're ready to receive the promises of God. One day, Jesus went to Jerusalem. And to go to Jerusalem, on his way, he passed through Samaria and Galilee. Jesus walked the border between the Jews in Galilee and the Samaritans. He crossed from one side to the other as often as he wanted to. It didn't bother him. It wasn't a problem for him. Whenever there was a chance to touch someone, or whenever there was a chance to perform a miracle, or whenever there was a chance to use the occasion as a teaching moment for his disciples, he went. Jesus would go wherever he needed to go and do whatever it took to do it. And so, as Jesus enters a certain village, it's interesting that there met him 10 men who were lepers. Now, leprosy is a horrible disease. It is once thought highly contagious and incurable. In this time, that's what they thought. It was contagious and incurable. And it's a result of a long-lasting infection caused by bacteria. Today, we know that it's easily treated and very rare in our society. But the symptoms mainly affected the skin, the nerves, and the mucous membranes. Mucous membranes are those moist areas just inside the body's openings. Today, it's known as Hansen's disease, if you want to look it up. And it causes skin lesions that may be faded or discolored, growths on the skin, thick, stiff, or dry skin, severe pain. It sounds like I'm giving a disclaimer from a pharmaceutical ad, I know, but just bear with me. Severe pain. I'm reading these, and I have about half of them. I don't know whether I need to get checked out. Numbness on affected areas of skin, muscle weakness or paralysis, especially in the hands and the feet, eye problems that may lead to blindness, enlarged nerves. I don't know how you see that, enlarged nerves, especially those around the elbow and the knee. A stuffy nose, nosebleeds, ulcers on the soles of your feet, loss of feeling or sensation can occur. And wouldn't you know it, that when loss of feeling occurs, injuries such as burns and fractures may go undetected or unnoticed. Ooh, that could be a problem. And the reason is because that you may not feel the pain, and the pain is there to warn you. Oh, it's hot. Pull back. No, you don't feel that pain because the nerves are deadened. Did you know that sin has the same effect? Long-term sin has the same effect. It causes a numbness of feeling that you can no longer detect the pain from sin that occurs that could harm your soul. Interesting. And in that day, sin and leprosy were synonymous. If you had leprosy, you were obviously a sinner. There was no other way around it. And the lepers stood afar off. I think that's interesting. And of course, if you know anything about the history of the time, they had to stand afar off. They couldn't come close. They weren't allowed to go near anyone, so they had to stay away. Could you imagine a life like this? Could you imagine the emotional trauma of being isolated and the physical trauma? As I'm preparing and looking at these lepers and this text, I just have visions of the Walking Dead. That's exactly what it's like. And it's interesting to me that these men, dressed as they are in their condition, they have the same drama. Isn't it interesting in our lives that many times the people that have the same drama seem to congregate together? That's what these men had. They felt rejected. And notice that they lifted up their voices and said, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." They cry out to get God's attention. They cry out, "Please help us." They lift up their voices to Jesus. They knew who Jesus was. I know that social media hadn't peaked yet, but the word about Jesus had spread. They knew who Jesus was. I'm sure his picture was up all over on posters in the village. They knew who Jesus was. They saw him coming, and they cried out to Jesus. They didn't go to the courthouse and ask the government for help. Their condition was considered incurable. There was no hope. They cry out from afar, Jesus, please have pity on us. They look deformed and broken. They look shattered. Jesus, please help us. Jesus, please heal us. Jesus, please, we need a miracle. We need to get our lives back. And when Jesus saw them, now I want you to take notice of this, that Jesus saw them. He heard their cry and he saw them. Do you know that when you cry out, Jesus sees you too? He sees you when you cry out. He hears you. He turns. He looks at you. And it's interesting that then Jesus says, go show yourselves to the priests. And some of you are saying, well, okay, why would they go to the priest? Well, in that day, the priest was to confirm the healing. It was the priest that would give them the check mark, the approval, the stamp of approval that they were healed and made whole again. It would validate their healing. They would be able to enter back into society, no longer contagious, no longer banished. But they could be embraced once again by their friends and family. Imagine that moment. A moment in your life like this when you're banished from others and isolated from family and friends, and then an opportunity for a reunion, the touch of love from another person. And Jesus speaks this healing into existence from afar. But there is one itsy-beatsy teeny tiny little problem. When Jesus speaks it, physically, there's no evidence. Jesus says, go to the priests. Now, if my recollection is right, you couldn't go to the priest until after you were healed. And Jesus says, go show yourself to the priest before. Do you see a problem? Because I do. I see a huge problem because I can just see these 10 guys who are lepers hearing Jesus' words, go show yourself to the priest, and them looking at one another and thinking, wait a minute, we're not healed yet. And you want us to go to the priest? The implication that Jesus is giving is that by the time you get there, you'll be healed. In other words, there's something that you have to do. You have to obey now, and by the time you get there, do you know that Jesus says the same thing to us today? We need to obey now. And by the time we get there, we'll be healed. Did you hear me? Jesus says to you and me today that we need to obey his word today. You say, but I'm not healed yet. No, it doesn't matter. Jesus wants you to obey the same today. By the time we get there, by the time I get to glory, by the time I'll be healed. See, we get hung up when Jesus says obey, and we think about conditions in our mind. And it's important that when the word comes to us and we receive the word, that we step and move. We start moving in the right direction. Because if we don't, we won't be healed. Start moving in the right direction. And the 10 men started moving towards the priest. I don't know how far it was. I don't know whether it was in that village, or it doesn't say, but they start moving, and somewhere along the way, the healing takes place. And one of them, when he saw that he was healed, returned and with a loud voice glorified God and fell down on his face at Jesus' feet, giving thanks. And he was a Samaritan. Oh, do you see a problem? The implication is that the other 9 were not Samaritans, possibly. But he was. And the implication is that quite possibly 9 or some of the others were probably Jews, and probably all 9 were Jews. And this one was a Samaritan. And oh, by the way, Jesus was a Jew. And you know from what we talked about earlier how Jews and Samaritans got along so well. They just loved each other to death. And this Samaritan comes back at Jesus' feet, outcast as a leper, outcast as a Samaritan dog. Twice an outcast. No hope, no future. His only friends in life to this point recently have been lepers. 9 others, to be exact. He turns around with a loud voice. And he comes back. He's overcome with emotion. He's overcome with gratitude and humility. And so Jesus answers and says, didn't I heal 10? Where's the other 9? Why aren't there not 10? And except this foreigner. And Jesus said to him, arise and go on your way. Your faith has made you well. 10 men healed, 1 returns to give thanks. There's something different about this one. Something totally different about this guy.
The other night, why did they just go on? Where are the other 9? These lives have just begun. Out of 10, why is there only one?
So what's different between the 9 and the 1? There's a lot of theory, a lot of possibility why 1 would return. And I thought that maybe it would be better to look at it from a different angle. I thought it would be better to go back and take these 9 off of the tour they were on, because they obviously were 9 lepers that had been healed, and they probably had a book deal, and probably Oprah had them on, and you know, this was miraculous, this healing that took place. And so let's catch up with them a year later and interview them, these 9, and ask them one question. What's the greatest day of your life? What's the greatest day of your life? And these 9 in unison say that the greatest day of our lives was the day we were healed of leprosy. And applause, 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 and cheers. The greatest day of our life was the day we were healed of leprosy. We were changed. Because before we were healed, we couldn't greet anybody. We lived in a separate colony. We had no friends. People avoided us like the plague. We couldn't go to the synagogue. We couldn't go to the temple. We were outcasts. Our life was death. But that moment changed our lives. The day I was healed, one of the 9 said, was the greatest day of my life. But before we interview the one that returned, before we get his story, let's go back and look a little bit at the Gospels. The Gospels are the story of Jesus. There are 4 of them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each one has although they're similar in stories, they sometimes have different perspectives because they're told by 4 different men. And Jesus, especially in Luke's gospel, but in the Gospels, you'll see Jesus is really something. I mean, people are in awe of Jesus. I mean, we see in our society today that people are in awe of different figures and athletes and stuff, but Jesus is really something. He's unique. He's different. And so let's jump into the 5th chapter of Luke for just a moment, and the story of the miracle of the fish. Simon, Peter, James, and John have been fishing, and they come back to the shore, and they've caught nothing, and Jesus commandeers their boat and has them go out away from the shore so he can teach for a few hours. He has a little teaching. They'd never met Jesus before. And Jesus is in the boat, and after he finishes teaching, he turns around and he says, "Go out into the deep water and put your nets down." And they look at one another, and they look at Jesus, and they go, "We fished all night, and we caught nothing." And Jesus says, "Go out, put your nets down, and catch some fish." And so, okay. They go out, and they put their nets down, and the haul is so huge, it's breaking their nets. It's unbelievable. There's so many fish. And Simon Peter's response is he falls down at Jesus' feet and he says, "I'm unworthy. Get away from me. I'm a sinful man." He gets it. He gets it. A few verses later, Jesus touches a leper. Did you hear me? Jesus touches a leper. A leper is unclean. Nobody touches a leper. Jesus touches a leper and something happens. The clean made the unclean clean. Jesus did something unheard of. A few verses later, Jesus is teaching in a house. It's crowded. People are standing outside, and a man is lowered down through the roof. They cut a hole in the roof, and they lower down this man, and the Pharisees are just standing there waiting for Jesus to heal this guy. We got him. And Jesus says to the man, "Your sins are forgiven." And the Pharisees go, who is this who forgives sins? Who is this? And Jesus says, "That you may know that the Son of Man has the power on earth to forgive sins, I say to this man, arise, pick up your bed and go home." Wow. Wow. Jesus' purpose is to forgive sins. The healing is just a side action. The healing is to show what can happen. But the forgiveness of sins, wow. We can't see it. There's not an app for that. How many sins do I have today? There's not a meter for that. It's on the inside. We can't see it. Oh, we feel it. But we can't see it. Jesus has the power to forgive the sins. Which is more important? The healing of the body or the healing of the soul? Which one is eternal? The healing of the body or the healing of the soul? Jesus goes on in the 7th chapter of Luke. A sinner woman is washing his feet with her tears. And the disciples have a little problem. What's going on here? This is a little much. And so they question Jesus, and Jesus says, one who is forgiven much loves much. And the disciples say, who is this man who forgives sins? In the 10th chapter, Jesus says, I tell you that many prophets and kings have desired to see what you see, and they haven't seen it. And to hear what you hear, they haven't heard it. The message Jesus says is, I am here. Jesus is here. And a few verses later, he tells Martha, he says, one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen the good part, and it will not be taken from her. Jesus is everything. He's everything. The man who came to forgive sins, fall down at his feet, find him, fall in love with him. So let's go back and interview the 10th leper, the one who returned. We're going to ask him the same question as the other 9. What was the greatest day of your life? What was the greatest day of your life? And he says, the greatest day of my life was the day I met the man who could heal leprosy. The greatest day of my life was the day I met the man who could forgive sins. And that day continues every day. Have you met the man that forgives sins? Do you know him? Have you met him? You're never the same. He changes you in ways you never imagined. He wants you. Oh, how he wants you. And you can meet him today, right here, right now. You can cry out on his name and he'll hear you. Jesus, I need you. Jesus, I want you. Jesus, I can't live without you because my condition is incurable. Nobody can forgive sins but Jesus.
Thank you, Jesus. You set me free. Christ, my Savior, you rescued